You ever notice how 100-year-old barn still stands straight while a fancy new shed sags after 10 winters? That old wood was treated with something that cost the cowboy almost nothing. And I stood there in my own leaky garage spending real money on sprays that failed, feeling like a fool. Here's the truth I came to, slow and stubborn. The men who worked cattle from Texas to Montana kept their food, their tools, their homes, and their own bodies going on tricks that cost pennies. Not because they were cheap, because they had no choice, and no choice made them smart in ways we forgot. Every one of these tricks came out of dust and hard weather, and most of them still work in a suburban kitchen or a parked truck today. Stick with me, because near the end I'll hand you a preservation method written down on the old Goodnight-Loving Trail back in 1866, one that keeps eggs fresh for months with no refrigerator at all. I tested it on my own back porch, and I'll tell you exactly what happened. I grew up around cattle country, but I spent 40 years doing everything the modern, convenient, expensive way. I bought the gadget, I paid the subscription, I trusted the label. And one cold morning, standing in my grandfather's old tack room, running my hand along a leather strap he oiled 60 years ago that still bent soft and supple, I finally understood how much I'd been throwing away. Let me show you what changed my mind. Let's start with something in your kitchen right now that you're probably throwing in the trash. Bacon grease. Every time you fry up breakfast, you pour that golden fat down the drain or wipe it into the garbage. The old cowboys would have called that plain wasteful, and they'd have been right. On the long cattle drives, nothing got wasted. The trail cook, the man they called the cookie, ran the whole outfit's morale off a single cast-iron kitchen on wheels called the chuck wagon. That wagon was invented in 1866 by a Texas rancher named Charles Goodnight, the same man whose trail I mentioned a minute ago. He took an old army wagon, built a box of drawers on the back, and turned feeding a dozen hungry men into a science. And on that wagon, bacon grease was treated like money. Here's what they did with it. They saved every drop in a tin. They used it to fry the next meal, sure, but they also rubbed it into dry leather, coated their cast iron to stop rust, greased the wagon axles when the store-bought grease ran low, and even smeared a thin layer on exposed skin to block wind and sun on the worst days. One tin of grease did the work of 5 different products we pay for separately today. I started saving mine in a mason jar by the stove. I use it to season my skillet and to start a fire in the wood stove when the kindling's damp. A spoon of bacon fat on a wad of newspaper catches a flame every single time, even when the paper's a little wet. I haven't bought a fire starter in 2 years. That's a small thing, $40 a year maybe, but it adds up, and it's the first crack in a much bigger wall. Because here's what I started to wonder. If they could stretch 1 tin of grease across 5 jobs, what else were we buying separately that used to be one simple thing? Turns out, a whole lot, and it gets better the deeper you go. Take rust. We treat rust like a disaster today. A tool gets a little orange on it and folks toss it or run out to buy a replacement. The cowboy couldn't do that. The nearest hardware store might be a 4-day ride away, and every knife, every bit, every buckle had to last. They knew something about rust that the stores would rather you never learn, because rust removal is a business now. There are whole shelves of chemical sprays that cost $8, $10, $12 a bottle, and they're mostly acid and water with a fancy label. The old hands had a better way, and it was sitting in the chuck wagon the whole time. Molasses. Plain blackstrap molasses, the cheap dark syrup they carried by the barrel to sweeten beans and coffee. You mix 1 part molasses to about 9 parts water, drop your rusty tool in, and let it sit. The natural acids in the molasses, weak organic acids, slowly pull the rust off the iron without eating the good metal underneath. It takes a week or two, not minutes, so you need a little patience. But it costs almost nothing, it won't burn your skin, and it won't poison the ground when you dump it out. Range and agricultural chemists have looked at this. Mild organic acid baths lift iron oxide off steel while leaving the base metal sound, which is exactly why museum conservators use gentle acid soaks on old iron artifacts instead of harsh grinding. The cowboy figured out with a syrup barrel what the scientists confirmed a century later with lab equipment. I had an old hatchet head that belonged to my father. It was so rusted I'd written it off. I dropped it in a bucket of molasses and water, set it behind the shed, and forgot about it for 12 days. When I pulled it out and scrubbed it with a wad of steel wool, the steel underneath was clean and gray and solid. That hatchet hangs in my kitchen now. I didn't spend a dime beyond a jug of syrup I already had. But cleaning a tool is one thing. Keeping it from rusting again is another, and this is where I learned the old-timers were playing a longer game than I ever imagined. Because the real secret wasn't removing rust. It was making sure it never came back. And the way they did that changes how you'll look at every metal thing you own. The answer again was fat, but treated a certain way. After they cleaned a blade, they'd heat it gently and rub in rendered tallow, the fat off a beef animal, or that same saved bacon grease. The warm metal drank the fat into its pores, and it left a thin seal that water couldn't get through. This is the exact same principle behind seasoning a cast iron pan, and it's why a well-kept cowboy skillet from the 1880s still cooks better than a brand new one off the store shelf. Think about that. We buy non-stick pans coated in chemicals that flake off after a couple years, and we throw them away and buy another. The cowboy's iron skillet outlived him and got handed down to his grandkids. One pan, a lifetime, zero replacement cost. The old way didn't just save money once, it saved money forever, because it was built to never need replacing. And that's the thread that started to make me angry, in a slow burn kind of way. Everything the old hands did was built to last and cost nothing to maintain. Everything we're sold today is built to wear out and keep us paying. Somewhere along the line, somebody figured out there's more money in selling you the same thing over and over than in teaching you how to make one thing last. Hold on to that thought, because it runs through everything else I'm about to show you. Now let's talk about food, because this is where it stops being about a few dollars and starts being about survival. On a 3-month cattle drive from Texas up to the Kansas railheads, there was no ice, no refrigerator, no cold box, yet those men ate meat the whole way. How? They understood preservation in a way most of us have completely lost. The first method was salt, but not the way you think. They didn't just sprinkle salt on meat. They packed it, buried it in salt completely, drew every bit of moisture out until the meat went hard and dry. Bacteria can't grow without water, and salt pulls the water right out of the cells. A properly salted slab of pork or beef could ride in a wagon through Texas summer heat for weeks and stay good. The United States Army ran its whole frontier supply system on salt pork for exactly this reason going back to the 1840s and 50s. The second method was smoke, and here's the part that surprised me. Smoke doesn't just flavor meat. The compounds in wood smoke, things chemists now call phenols and aldehydes, actually kill bacteria and slow the fat from going rancid. When a cowboy hung meat in a smoky shed, he was coating it in a natural preservative that modern food scientists have measured and confirmed. Cold smoking over a low, slow fire could add weeks of shelf life. The old hands didn't know the chemistry by name. They just knew the smoked meat lasted and the fresh meat didn't. And here's the everyday part, the part I want you to actually try. You can make jerky in your own kitchen oven this weekend with nothing but a cheap cut of beef, some salt, and a low heat. Slice the meat thin against the grain, salt it well, and set your oven as low as it'll go, propping the door open a crack so the moisture escapes. Let it dry for 6 to 8 hours. What you get is real jerky that costs a third of what the gas station charges, with no preservatives you can't pronounce. I make a batch every couple weeks. My grandkids eat it faster than I can dry it. Now, I know some of you are sitting in an apartment in the city right now thinking this is all fine for a man with a barn and a pasture, but it's got nothing to do with your life. I thought the same thing for years. So let me speak straight to you for a minute, because this next stretch is built specifically for the folks with no land, no shed, and no cattle. These tricks work in a third-floor kitchen just as well as they work on the open range, and some of them work even better. Start with your windows. Cowboys and homesteaders on the plains had brutal winters and no insulation to speak of, and heating fuel was precious. So they learned to seal a room tight and hold the heat they had. The trick that carried down to me was the simplest thing in the world: heavy fabric over the windows at night, a thick blanket or a heavy curtain, hung so it covers the glass and drapes past the sill, traps a pocket of still air against the cold pane, and stops the heat in your room from bleeding straight out the window. Modern building scientists at more than one land-grant university have measured this. A large share of a home's heat loss goes straight through the windows, and even a simple insulated curtain can cut that loss dramatically, sometimes by a quarter or more on a single-pane window. In an apartment where you can't touch the windows and you're paying every month for heat, that's real money back in your pocket every single winter. I put heavy curtains on my bedroom windows 2 winters ago and dropped my heating bill by almost $30 a month in the cold season. That's a trick from a sod house on the Nebraska plains working in a modern home, no land required. That idea, one simple thing doing the work of many expensive ones, is exactly what pulled me into writing Frontier Habits, a book where I laid out the full set of cowboy preservation and self-reliance methods I've spent years tracking down and testing myself. If this way of thinking speaks to you, the book goes deeper than any single video can, covering tools, food, water, and the home, all in one place. You can find it linked in the description below. Now, back to what I started to wonder after that first jar of bacon grease sitting by my stove. Here's another one for the apartment dweller. Cowboys kept their drinking water cool in the desert with no ice by using evaporation. They'd wrap a canteen or a clay jug in a wet cloth or a wet burlap sack and hang it in the shade where the air moved. As the water in the cloth evaporated, it pulled heat out of the container, and the water inside stayed cool even in blistering heat. You can do the exact same thing with a bottle of water, a wet sock or dish towel, and a breezy windowsill. It's the same physics that runs a swamp cooler. During a summer power outage, that little trick will keep your water and even your butter cool enough to use, and it costs you nothing but a wet rag. And the thing that ties all these together, whether you're on a ranch or in a walk-up apartment, is that not one of them requires you to keep paying somebody. You learn it once, you own it for life. That's the whole difference between the old way and the new way, and once you feel that difference, you can't unsee it. So let's go back to the food, because I promised you something bigger and I want to build up to it right. We covered salting meat and smoking it, but there was a whole other side to cowboy preservation that had nothing to do with meat, and it's the one that shocked me most when I dug into it: sourdough. That chuck wagon cook I mentioned, the cookie guarded one thing above all else on the whole drive: his sourdough starter. It was a pot of fermented flour and water, alive with wild yeast and good bacteria, and he used it to make bread and biscuits every single day with no store-bought yeast anywhere for hundreds of miles. Some cooks kept the same starter alive for years, even carried it to bed with them on cold nights so it wouldn't freeze and die. They call the old-timers who lived in Alaska and the Yukon sourdoughs because a man's starter was that central to staying alive. Here's what makes it genius. The sour in sourdough comes from lactic acid, the same acid that preserves food. That acidity meant the bread lasted longer before molding, and the fermentation actually made the nutrition in the grain easier for the body to absorb. Modern nutrition researchers have confirmed that the long fermentation in real sourdough breaks down some of the compounds that make regular bread hard to digest, and it lowers the way the bread spikes your blood sugar. The cowboy was eating healthier bread than most of us buy today, and he was making it for pennies with a pot of living dough that never ran out. You can start your own starter this week with nothing but flour and water and thyme. Mix equal parts, leave it on the counter, feed it a little fresh flour and water each day, and in about a week the wild yeast in your own kitchen air will bring it to life. From then on, that starter can make bread for the rest of your life for the cost of flour alone. No packets, no yeast to buy, nothing to subscribe to. One of the mothers of these starters, kept going in San Francisco, is said to trace back well over 150 years. Think about a food source that outlives the person who made it. But keeping bread was one problem. Keeping the thing that goes on the bread and the eggs and the milk without any refrigeration at all, that was the real test of frontier know-how. And this is where I found the method I've been promising you since the start, the one from 1866 that I tested on my own porch. Before I give it to you, though, I need to tell you about the trick that saved more cowboy lives than any gun ever did. It's about water and sickness. Out on the trail, the biggest killer wasn't rustlers or stampedes or snakebite. It was bad water and the sickness that came from it. Whole outfits could be laid low by drinking from the wrong creek. The cowboys learned the hard way and over many years how to make questionable water safer, and their tricks are worth knowing the next time your tap runs brown or a storm knocks out your town's water. First, they let muddy water settle. They'd fill a bucket and leave it still overnight, and by morning the silt and much of the filth had sunk to the bottom, leaving cleaner water on top to pour off gentle. Simple, but it removes a surprising amount of what makes you sick. Second, when they could, they boiled it, because they'd learned that water off a rolling boil didn't make men sick the way raw creek water did. This was before most folks understood germs at all, yet the practice was dead right. Boiling water for even a minute kills the bacteria and parasites that cause the worst of it. And third, the clever one, they used charcoal from their own campfires. A cowboy would take a piece of hardwood charcoal, crush it, and use it to filter water through a cloth, or he'd drop it in to help clean and sweeten a bad-tasting supply. Activated charcoal is used in water filters you buy in the store today for exactly the same reason. It grabs onto impurities and pulls bad taste and some toxins right out. The cowboy did it with a lump from last night's fire. That knowledge could matter to you the next time the power's out and the store shelves are bare, and it doesn't cost you a thing to know it. Now all of this points to the same buried truth, and it's time I said it plain. Somewhere over the last 100 years we traded knowing how for paying for. We stopped knowing how to keep our food, clean our water, seal our homes, and fix our tools, and we started paying a company for each and every one of those things, month after month, year after year. The old skills didn't disappear because they stopped working. They disappeared because there's no profit in a man who can take care of himself. That's the villain in this story. Not one company, a whole way of doing business that needs you helpless to keep you paying. Which brings me finally to the eggs. This is the one I've been holding back, and it's the one I most want you to walk away with. On the Goodnight-Loving Trail, opened in 1866 by Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving, and on ranches and homesteads all across the frontier, people faced a problem we've completely forgotten. Hens lay lots of eggs in spring and summer, and hardly any in the cold, dark months of winter. There was no refrigerator and no grocery store to buy eggs from in January. So how did they eat eggs all winter? They preserved the eggs laid in spring fresh for 6 months or more, using a method that costs almost nothing and that almost nobody alive today has heard of. It's called water glassing. Here's how it works, and here's how I did it myself. You take fresh eggs, unwashed, straight from a farm or a farm stand, because the egg comes with a natural protective coating called the bloom that must stay on. You never wash these eggs. You take a bucket or a large jar and you mix up a solution of pickling lime, which is calcium hydroxide, in water, about 1 ounce of lime to every quart of water. You gently lower your clean, unwashed eggs into that solution until they're fully covered, pointed end down, put a lid on, and store it somewhere cool and dark. That's the whole thing. The lime solution seals the pores of the eggshell and creates an environment where bacteria simply can't grow. The eggs sit there, submerged, staying fresh for 6 months, 8 months, some folks report a year or more. This isn't folklore. Agricultural researchers studied methods of preserving eggs without refrigeration in the early 1900s, and water glassing, sometimes done with sodium silicate instead of lime, was recommended by household and farm authorities well into the 1940s. Right up until the electric refrigerator became common in every home and the knowledge got shoved aside as old-fashioned. I didn't believe it, I'll be honest with you. It sounded like a way to get sick. So I got 24 fresh, unwashed eggs from a neighbor with hens, mixed my lime water in a glass crock, and set it on my cool back porch in the fall. I marked the calendar. 5 months later, in the dead of winter, with the pointed end of a spoon and a good deal of doubt, I lifted one out, rinsed it, and cracked it into a hot skillet. The white was firm. The yolk stood up tall and orange. It fried up and smelled exactly like a fresh egg because it was one. I ate it and I'm here talking to you. 5 months, no refrigeration, no electricity for the price of a little lime. Think about what that means for you. A dozen eggs preserved in the fall for pennies apiece, ready to eat in the middle of winter or in the middle of an emergency when the store shelves go empty. This is a skill that fed families through frontier winters and Great Depression hardship, kept alive by a handful of country folks and old homesteaders who never let it die, and now it's yours. You can set up a batch this very weekend on a shelf in your pantry or the corner of an apartment closet. No land, no animals, no monthly payment to anybody. Just eggs, lime, water, and a little of the knowledge they hoped you'd forget. That's the piece I most wanted to put in your hands because it proves the whole point. The old ways weren't backward, they were free. And free is exactly what nobody wants to sell you. Here's what I've come to know, standing in that tack room, frying that 5-month-old egg, pulling that clean steel out of a bucket of syrup. Every one of these tricks was a way of saying, I don't need to depend on anybody but myself. That independence didn't cost more, it cost less. We were told the modern way was progress, but a good part of it was just a longer, more expensive leash. And the men who worked cattle 150 years ago were freer in their poverty than a lot of us are. With all our gadgets and subscriptions, if you're the kind of person who'd rather know how to do a thing than pay forever to have it done for you, then these old cowboy ways aren't history to you. They're a map back to something we let get taken. You feel it too, I think, or you wouldn't have watched this far, so let me ask you something, and I want you to actually answer me down in the comments. Of everything I showed you, which one are you going to try first? The molasses rust bath, the jerky in your oven, or the water-glassed eggs from the Goodnight-Loving Trail? Tell me which one, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read them, and I want to know how far this old know-how is traveling. If you've ever water-glassed an egg or salted your own meat, I especially want to hear from you because your experience helps every other person reading. And if you feel that pull, that itch to recover the skills that made regular folks free and self-reliant, then come stand with the rest of us who are digging these things back up one by one. There's a whole lost library of this frontier know-how, and I'm bringing it back piece by piece. Next time, I'm going to show you how the Cowboys treated wounds and sickness on the trail with 3 plants that probably grow within a mile of where you're sitting right now, and one of them stops bleeding faster than anything in your medicine cabinet. You won't want to miss which plant it is. Stick with me, and let's keep taking this knowledge back, one old trick at a time. This video gave you the overview, but there's so much more. Inside the Frontier Circle, I walk you through every trick, step by step, with my own results, the full story I couldn't fit here. And if something doesn't work in your kitchen, ask me directly and I answer you myself, not some machine. You won't be alone, old ways folks like you are already in there with me. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen. Cancel any time. Come join me. If these old cowboy tricks helped you today, there's plenty more waiting right here. Go ahead and subscribe, then look around the channel for more simple ways to save.